So there you were on the scene of a cardiac arrest. You were going to control the airway. Now, we already know what the literature is about intubation versus supraglottics. Oh, do we know that literature? We don't know the answer, but we do know the literature about intubation versus supraglottic. We've seen the part. We've seen the airways too. But let's just say, for the sake of, say, this podcast, that you want to put in a supraglottic. Now, the question is, what kind of supraglottic should you go for? Should you go for the King LT? Should you go for an iGel? What does the literature say about the difference? Well, what the literature says up until now is, oh, that's right, it doesn't. We don't have good literature, but we do now. And when we get back from the break, I'm going to introduce you to an outstanding young researcher who's doing a great job helping us understand the differences.
What is a lighthouse? It is a tower with a bright light at the top, located at an important or dangerous place. The main purpose of a lighthouse is to serve as a navigational aid and to warn of dangerous areas. Welcome to the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, illuminating the darkness of current EMS clinical practice with the bright light of science. Here's your host, Dr. Jeff Jarvis.
Howdy, y'all. I'm Dr. Jeff Jarvis. Welcome back to another episode of the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast. You know the one. This is the podcast where we shine the bright light of science in the darkness of current clinical practice. This episode, I have somebody special I want to introduce you to. This is a young researcher that Dr. Crowe introduced me to. I saw a paper he did, and I saw it at a really good time. I am working on a project where we're trying to summarize the literature about airway management in the pre-hospital setting. And one of the questions we're trying to answer is, in cardiac arrest, should we do iGels or King LTs? Which supraglottic airway is the best? And there's just not great literature on this. And Rimley sends me this paper. It's exactly what I was looking for. And then she says, hey, you've got to meet this researcher. He is doing great work. Let me introduce you. So fortunately, we have him here. Let's get to that interview. Tanner Smida, welcome so much to the podcast. Thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here.
So I think Rimley made me aware of your work. You published 3 papers that really got my attention over, it seems like the last 3-4 months. You did the paper we're going to talk about today, which is comparing iGel to King LT in cardiac arrest. But you also did some great work on patients who are in cardiac arrest, get ROSC, and you're looking at different ways of using the post-ROSC vital signs to predict outcome. We may have to have you back on the podcast to talk about those because I think those are really, really interesting. Let's talk a little bit about this supraglottic airway battle here. One of the reasons that I was so excited about your paper is I have really been struggling to get my brain around the results of PART and Airways 2. So as you very well know, PART was King LT versus intubation as the primary device in cardiac arrest. That was the US trial. And then Airways 2 is the British trial, which was iGel versus intubation. And even though we both can probably spend the next 4 hours picking both of these apart, ultimately the bottom line was there was no difference between the iGel and intubation. And there was a slight difference favoring the King LT versus intubation in PART. And since then, I've been trying to wrap my head around trying to basically do a network meta-analysis in my little brain here to compare the different types of supraglottics. Sure enough, that's what you did. Do you mind just giving us a rundown? Talk to us about this paper.
Sure. So in the United States, it seems the 2 most commonly used supraglottic airway devices are, like you said, the King LT and the iGel. And they both have the same indications. They're used for roughly the same purpose. There are slight differences in their design. So the iGel has no inflatable cuffs. It's a blind insertion airway device that at the tip, it has a thermoplastic elastomer that seals around the perilaryngeal anatomy and creates a seal in that manner. The King LT, it's also a blind insertion airway device, but it has a pair of cuffs, one which inflates in the esophagus and one that inflates in the oropharynx to create a seal. And so, it's possible that because of these differences in design, that there's some difference in the effectiveness of these devices in ventilating patients or in terms of first pass airway success. And so, because of their popularity and the fact that they've never been compared to one another, despite both being widely used and similar in cost and those kinds of things, we decided to do this analysis using the ESO dataset. And so the ESO dataset, it's a large repository of electronic patient care records completed by paramedics. And so we queried this database and ended up with over 90,000 cardiac arrest patients that had their airway managed with either a King laryngeal tube or an iGel. And we compared the devices using some statistical techniques called multivariate logistic regression and propensity score matching to kind of adjust for some baseline imbalances in these groups. And we compared them with respect to first pass success. We looked at return of spontaneous circulation, or ROSC. We looked at the rate of pre-hospital rearrest. And then we also looked at the rate of survival to discharge to home. So these are the patients that made it out of the hospital and went back to their primary residence or their home, as opposed to patients that went to nursing homes or long-term acute care facilities. We kind of use this as a proxy for good neurologic outcome. And so when we compared these devices, we found that whenever we looked at all the patients together in this data set, we found that the iGel was associated with better outcomes than the King LT with respect to every outcome we looked at. So ROSC, rearrest, survival to discharge to home, first pass success, the iGel was the winner overall. Now, we also did some sub-analyses, and we basically, in order to try to get an idea of what the effect size of the iGel is without any confounding effect of endotracheal intubation, we removed all cases that had endotracheal intubation attempted either before or after supraglottic airway placement. And we were not able to, we did not see any relationship between the iGel and improved survival to discharge to home in comparison to the King LT. But we did find an association between better ROSC, rearrest, and first pass success. Those were maintained when intubations were removed.
So two analyses here. So you did a ton of sensitivity analyses here that I want to ask you about, just for this podcast is kind of for nerds. So this is a thing nerds love to talk about. You looked at two groupings. You looked at all airways overall, and then only the where the supraglottic was the primary. So how often, you said that you pulled out the supraglottics as a rescue, but then you also pulled those out where the supraglottic was the primary and ET was the rescue. I'm kind of curious about that, just because of some other work I'm looking at about unintended airway failure. But how often did you see the supraglottic as a primary with ET as a rescue?
So it was definitely a minority of the cases. I want to say it was maybe a little over 10% had a supraglottic airway placed successfully, and then for whatever reason in the pre-hospital setting, an endotracheal tube was placed later. The rate of having a rescue endotracheal intubation was higher for the iGel patients in the iGel group.
Interesting. So that might be one surrogate marker for the failure of that device versus a King LT.
Correct. Yeah. Or paramedics feeling that it wasn't as close to a definitive airway as the King LT. Maybe increased PEEP was needed because of an aspiration event or something, and so they switched it out later.
Do you happen to remember what that rate was? How often they did that?
The number, the 10.2% is sticking out in my mind, but I have a copy of the paper here. I can check the table.
If you don't mind, look that up, because the reason I'm asking is I'm at the MedStar system in Fort Worth right now, and my predecessor, Veer Vitellani, did a paper where he's looking at unrecognized King LT failures using entitled CO2, and he found about 14% failures with the King LT. And I'm just looking to kind of see, is this in the range of what you were seeing with all supraglottics?
Sure. So for ETT after a supraglottic airway, the rate was 10.6% for the iGel group, and it was
Okay.
6.9% for the King LT group.
Wow. Yeah. So that's number one. That sounds definitely higher with the iGel group, and both of them are lower than what we saw. One possible explanation for it is the unrecognized part. We were doing that based solely on entitled CO2. So, do you have any thoughts about why we might be seeing more failures with, or at least perceived failures with the iGel than the King LT?
So based on what I've heard paramedics say about these devices, I would say that paramedics have a lower confidence in the iGel with respect to staying in the airway for long periods of transport. I've heard a lot of complaints about these airways popping out if they're not properly secured. In addition, because they don't have a cuff, I think people perceive that they might not be as adept at preventing aspiration or protecting the airway, so to speak. And so it could just be that that provider bias that leads them to exchange these devices for tubes more frequently. And it could also be something like there are more BLS agencies that are placing iGels than King. So if BLS responders are arriving first, placing the iGels, and then you have ALS responding later, and for whatever reason they want to switch it out for endotracheal tube.
Boy, that's a great insight right there. So if your system has BLS using iGels and then you have an ALS agency that comes in and can intubate, they might be more likely to pull it. And if you have more agencies that are using King LT as a sole airway and not having ALS agencies come in, you would clearly see that less. Now, this is one of the limitations of using the ESO dataset. As much as I love this dataset, it's blinded, which means we don't know anything about these agencies. We don't know what their protocols are. So we used the iGel at my last system, and some of the issues that we heard was specifically around that thermoplastic cuff, if you will. It's not an inflatable cuff. It has to warm up, and as it does, it forms around the oropharyngeal opening. The other big issue is it does have a tendency to work its way out, so you really have to keep it in. And that's the reason the company made that little headset or the strap that they did to pull it in. So if the perception, well, let's just go on the assumption that there is more aspiration and there is more failure with the iGel, which I'm not sure is true, but let's go on that assumption. Despite that, there was still higher survival with the iGel.
There was, yes.
I'd like to dig in a little bit about your analysis because I think this is really fascinating. Because this is not a randomized controlled trial, there is always the potential for confounding variables that are not measured. So you tried a couple of different ways to address baseline differences between the groups. You did two: multivariable logistic regression and propensity matching. Can you explain a little bit about what those are? And then, and again, you don't have to like draw graphs or anything, but if you don't mind, I actually may drop a graph of the least squares thing for model for regression just because I'm a jerk. Can you talk a little bit about what the objective is with both of those and how they differ?
Sure, yeah. So with any retrospective data set, whenever you form two groups to evaluate a treatment or otherwise, inevitably you're going to end up with some baseline imbalances because these patients aren't randomized in a one-to-one manner. And so in order to adjust for differences that may arise in things that we know are important to cardiac arrest survival, for example, initial rhythm, the age of the patient, whether they receive bystander CPR, response time, etc., both logistic regression and propensity score matching are statistical techniques to basically adjust for these baseline imbalances and control for them, basically. And so propensity score matching differs from adjusted logistic regression because for every patient in the data set, basically, based on the cluster of characteristics that this patient has, whether they receive bystander CPR or not, what their age is, what their response time is, that patient gets assigned a propensity score. And then based on that score, they can be matched with similar patients from the other treatment group, whatever treatment group that is. And this can be done in a one-to-one manner or a two-to-one manner, depending on how many patients you have in each group. And in the end, this is kind of leads to a quasi-randomization that gives you two groups that are approximately equal with respect to all these variables that we think are important to the outcomes that we're evaluating. So in this study, we looked at age, sex, whether or not the cardiac arrest was witnessed, if bystander CPR was provided, the response interval, initial rhythm, the out-of-hospital cardiac arrest location, whether that was in an assisted living facility, at home, at a private residence, or in public. We also looked at, and importantly, whether or not the airway, the supraglottic airway, was placed as a rescue device or a primary device. That was included in our statistical modeling. I also wanted to add one thing that we were able to do with the kind of logistic regression we used in our analysis is that we introduced the treating agency as a random effect. We didn't include any information on agency characteristics, whether they were volunteer, paid, composed primarily of part-time or full-time individuals, those kinds of things, whether they were rural or urban. And so introducing agency ID as a random effect kind of allowed us to control for differences that might arise based on agency characteristics.
So explain that for me, because this is something I read this in quite a few papers, but I'm not sure I truly understand that. How does that work?
Sure. So at least the way I understand it is that there is variation at both the patient level and at the agency level. And so basically the multi-level logistic regression accounts for variability at both levels, agency and the patient level.
So this is one way if, let's say, so theoretically, if you have one agency that works primarily in, I was going to say a geriatric population, but you're already controlling for age, in a really sick area for whatever the reason, high incidence of diabetes and heart disease and tuberculosis and I don't know, syphilis, whatever. And then in another area, you just happen to have like a triathlon community. This is the way that you would address that, even though you don't know the proportion of triathletes in the group. Did I get that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Yes. And thinking in terms of both, like I said, characteristics like rural and urban, and also things like levels of provider experience, things that either we can't really know or we just didn't include in our analysis.
Awesome. Before we started recording, you were mentioning that there may be some examples where propensity matching might be theoretically anyway preferred over regression. Can you talk about what those might be?
Sure. And so, whenever preparing to conduct the statistical analyses for this study, I did a bit of a literature review and looked around to see if there were any benefits of propensity score matching over adjusted logistic regression. Some authors said that there was, but this effect is more pronounced at small sample sizes. And so we had very large sample size, over 90,000 patients. And so the results,
I think that counts as large.
Yeah, there were very similar, regardless of the method we used.
Okay.
But there are some authors that suggest that propensity score matching is a better method.
So I kind of like this, that you had two methods. Maybe some experts are saying this might be a little bit better. So you said, hell with it, we'll do both and see if we get the same answer. And you did. So I think that's really helpful. So let me ask you this. What is your takeaway from this paper? How ready are you to say iGel is better?
Right. So to speak scientifically, I'd say that because this is data that's derived in a retrospective, observational manner, we cannot claim causation. We can only claim association, and then use this data as kind of the fuel to advocate for prospective studies or a randomized controlled trial, ideally. And in the meantime, I think that agency medical directors should use their own judgment based on the experience that their providers have with each airway. Make sure that we're doing the things like using end tidal capnography to make sure that we're not missing failed airways. Make sure that we're doing rigorous QA and QI. So that if there is a difference between these devices in terms of first pass success, we can maybe do something to mitigate that.
Man, I think you nailed it. That was a really, really great. You covered the limitations very well, like an honest, transparent researcher should. I'll tell you my takeaway. You've already covered the caveats that we have to say. The thing that is compelling to me about this is that the results hold up to a lot of different sensitivity analyses, and it is in a wide range of agencies, wide range of patients. This is not a small data set, and I think we are probably capturing a pretty pragmatic sample of how this is actually used in the wild as opposed to an artificial nature. So until we get a more definitive study, meaning a randomized controlled trial, I definitely think it's a strong signal, and it's going to reinforce perhaps my decision on which airway to go with. Where do you want to go with this next? What's the next question you have based on this?
Sure. So there are, as we've talked about, some inherent limitations to the ESO data set. So these are electronic patient care records filled out by paramedics. So a lot of them have missing covariates of interest. For example, even things as important as the initial rhythm of the patient. And so that really limited our sample size, and it might have biased our study sample because we got rid of a lot of patients that just didn't have documentation of those covariates of interest. In addition, while we have this survival to discharge to home metric that we can use as a proxy for neurologically intact survival, we didn't actually have neurologic outcome scoring for these patients, like cerebral performance category or the modified Rankin scale score. And so we've actually been in contact with the folks at Emory, the Cardiac Arrest Registry, to enhance survival, to do this analysis using their data set with respect to CPC 1 and 2 and neurologically intact survival.
CARES is often where you go after you've done the ESO trial because you really want that. One of the things that I think is unique about the ESO data set is you do have that survival to hospital discharge. That's not a NEMSIS field because it's frequently not known when you turn the patient over. And a lot of pre-hospital research ends up just looking at ROSC as a result of that. Can you tell us where that data came from?
Yeah, so it works with several hospitals, and they have a bidirectional data exchange set up. And now this is only available for about 20% of transported patients. So again, when we were looking at survival and basically hospital disposition and ED disposition, our sample size was even further reduced. But yeah, it's basically given from the receiving facilities from the hospitals to ESO for about 20% of cases.
One of the things that medics will say about it is, well, I don't get to read the narrative, the hospital discharge summary. That's true. Hopefully we will get that. But right now, the data elements that you do get allow us to do really meaningful research like this. We get to see what the outcomes are. I am so excited about this. I'm really looking forward to seeing what you do next. Well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's been great.
No, there is one question I've got to ask. Were you doing much work in research or presentations or teaching before medical school?
No. So I went straight through undergrad and right into medical school. Didn't have any experience in between or anything like that.
No public speaking, debate, high school, anything like that?
No. I mean, I've spoken at, conferences and things with the guys at Pitt and recently at WVU, but no experience outside of, research.
All right. Well, I'm going to say I really, really hate you then because, man, you nailed this. You're a natural at this.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, man. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you.
You've been listening to the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, a proud member of the FlightBridge Ed podcast family and a Fire Dog production. Visit flightbridgeed.com for more information.